So when FDR runs, keep in mind this guy's already run already as a vice presidential candidate. He ran for vice president when Al Smith was the candidate. And at the time of the election, unemployment was 25%. So that's a staggering number. Now we still have unemployment today. I said yesterday it's not really a problem. It is a problem, but it's not nearly the problem it was during the Great Recession or more importantly during the Great Depression. And perhaps most startling is the fact that half of our GDP had declined by 50%. Like we're half as rich a country as we were when Hoover took office. So they're going to run, Hoover. He's the incumbent president. Republicans are. And as I mentioned earlier, he's going to run with kind of the slogan / song that says prosperity is just around the corner. But for too many Americans, that corner is like way too far away. If you understand what I'm saying, like they're not remotely close to seeing that. The expression I used to hear during the pandemic was the light at the end of the tunnel has been turned off. So you couldn't see the end. And for a lot of Americans at 32, they couldn't see how we were going to get out of this. And that meant they were really looking for something completely different. And a lot of this election also has to do with the personality of FDR. So personality is important in candidates, particularly in federal and national office candidates. And FDR had this absolutely brilliant optimism. It almost glowed from him. He just gave off confidence, right? Confidence in America, confidence in himself, and it was infectious. People really liked that about FDR. And one of the things that's really interesting about FDR is how very similar he is to his fifth cousin. So if you have your study guide, one of the things I ask on the study guide is how was FDR and TR? How were their backgrounds similar? And they really were quite similar. In fact, FDR idolized TR. So FDR knew who TR was. They weren't really that close. By the way, he married TR's first cousin. So one of the funny things about Eleanor Roosevelt is that she was Eleanor Roosevelt Roosevelt. She was a Roosevelt when FDR married her, but they weren't remotely close enough to be like kissing cousins, like distant removed. But nonetheless, they were both descendants of a Dutch wealthy family in New York, the Knickerbockers, we would call these Dutch descendants. So you go way back in history to when the Dutch ran New York, up on the Hudson River. And FDR had a sort of estate, Hyde Park, it was called, and that was on the Hudson River. And so he was very, very wealthy. He came from a very rich family, and he went to Harvard. Both he and TR went to Harvard. He studied naval history like his cousin. He was very interested in the Navy. He was elected as a progressive governor in New York. So he had that in his background, as did TR. And they both served in the administration of Democrats, or in the case of TR, Republican, as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. So they both had federal, almost cabinet level positions. But while TR was known to be sort of like a bulldog almost, kind of imagine like one guy called him a veritable steam engine in pants. FDR was very chill. He was very calm. He was very smooth. His talking style was very comforting, and he was very nice. So they were different in terms of personality. They both were outdoorsmen. Both were excellent swimmers. The problem, of course, that we know about FDR, which is going to be a major difference between him and TR, is at the age of 39. That's important that you recognize this. So he's almost 40 years old. And by this point, he's been governor of New York. He's been assistant secretary of the Navy. So he's already done all that stuff. He contracts polio. And now polio was a scourge on American children. It was usually associated and called infantile paralysis. But polio is a waterborne virus. And he was swimming in a lake in Canada, and his legs stopped working later the next day. By the next day, he was already showing symptoms of polio. Now, some virologists have authored the thesis that it's Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is very, very similar. But it seems fairly consistent that it was polio. And so what it does is it paralyzes him from the waist down. So here was a man who was tall, handsome, charming, funny, very athletic, And in the midst of his career, 39 is by y'all's account probably really old. He gets polio, which was usually a children's problem. By the way, that is going to lead him to create it's child paralysis, some kind of name for a nonprofit that ends up becoming known as the March of Dimes. I don't know if you've ever heard of the March of Dimes or not, but FDR will ask people to send dimes to help fight polio. And it's one of the reasons why his face is on that coin. But the funny thing about it, and several of his biographers agree, getting polio actually helped him. Now, I know that sounds awful, but before this had happened, FDR was kind of seen as like a lightweight. He was seen as a rich dude who just was kind of smoothing along. And, he's kind of, people thought of him kind of a snobby. Well, when he gets polio, he says it helped him develop patience. He says after spending 12 months trying to wiggle a toe, he now understood what patience was like. He's going to buy a sanatorium, they called them, which is like a series of springs. They're warm springs down in Georgia. And he's going to go there to try to recuperate. They believe that water treatment, like swimming, would help keep the strength in their legs. And while he's in the South, he confronts racism, like full blown. He didn't really experience this in New York where he lived. And he's around children who have polio. And so he becomes much more, we might say, tenderhearted, much more kind, much more sympathetic to what he would call the forgotten man. But he didn't let his polio stop him. He got a car that he could drive with like pedals that he could use his hands to drive. So he would drive around at his place in Georgia, his resort home up in New York. And by the way, this is very fascinating to me too. FDR was never, at least publicly, photographed in a wheelchair. Now, that wasn't necessarily by his determination, but the media. So imagine today if the media didn't report that the president of the United States was disabled. Like the president was in a wheelchair. That would be weird, right? Like they didn't photograph him. They didn't show him in the wheelchair. And he had developed these really nifty techniques to not let it on to the public. So he had built up his strength in his arms using railings. And his son and his bodyguards were all very strong men. And he would walk with them by using their arms as like railings. And he had braces on his legs, so he would swing his legs. And so he looked awkward when he did it, but it looked like he could walk. And so he would stand at podiums and give speeches after getting polio. And what would happen is his legs were locked in place with these metal braces. But, it was a different period in history, obviously, when it comes to disabilities. And he was by far the most gifted president of the period at addressing the public. This guy, Reagan is going to be called the great communicator. That's his nickname in history. But before there was Reagan, there was FDR. He was the by far the best at communicating directly to the American people. And what was interesting about his marriage, it was seen as a marriage of political and sort of class association. Eleanor was called by her own family ugly. Like they called her that to her face. So that's harsh, right? Like when you're going to need to find a good man because you're ugly, right? And so she was considered the ugly duckling. And because of that, she had a very difficult childhood, tremendously shamed. And when she grew up, she had enormous sympathy for the unfortunate. And she will become, in many ways, the more liberal figure in this marriage. She will be the one who goes into the South and breaks segregation rules. She'll be the one who goes down into coal mines. And so she's often called in history FDR's legs. She would go where he couldn't, so to speak. And she will create a new, you realize I haven't talked about a first lady much since like Abigail Adams, or Dolly Madison, maybe Mary Lincoln. She sets a whole new precedent for what first ladies are supposed to do. She is a very active person in both the White House, but also out in the public. Like she is going to be often out speaking. There's a debate about whether or not Eleanor Roosevelt was homosexual. There appears to be no evidence directly saying that, meaning like direct, of course, but she surrounded herself with lots of women. She had a lot of women friends. She was very active in women's groups. And we know that Eleanor was unhappy in her marriage because before he got polio and even after, FDR had numerous mistresses. So he had lots of affairs, and that was problematic because she knew about it and she didn't like it. But they stayed married, and they had a very interesting marriage. It was almost like they were friends, more than romantic affection. And so that will continue up. He's with his mistress when he dies, one of his mistresses, so he liked to be around women. I'm not excusing the behavior. I'm just saying that his whole career, men were always working. Men were always, angry, and he liked to be around women's company. They comforted him. They made him feel better, and so that was some of his behavior. So I would definitely know this extraordinary couple of people. And here's a quote for you to digest from Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, she's going to live well after FDR. She's actually going to be one of the few first ladies who'll have a formal role in the United States government after being first lady. She's going to serve as a special envoy to the United Nations, and she helps draft the Human Declaration of Rights, the Declaration of Human Rights, excuse me. But this is what she said. Though Franklin himself never tried to discourage me and was undisturbed by anything I wanted to say or do, other people, she means in the West Wing, in the government, were less happy. For example, her racial beliefs. So she was very much against Jim Crow. She was very much in favor of racial equality, which at that time was still radical, right? And she was a supporter of the settlement house movement. She went and worked in them, and she cared very much for what we would call social justice. And they were afraid that this would hurt FDR's, reputation politically and socially. And I imagine she says they thought I was doing many things without his knowledge, and they blew up to him and other people. But I knew there was no use because our values, the people she worked with, our basic values were very different. Meaning, FDR was not going to tell Eleanor to stop, and he was aware of what she was doing. So she in many ways was able to communicate the things that he wanted liberally to communicate that Southern Democrats didn't want to hear. And the leader of their party shouldn't be saying it, is how they viewed it. So Eleanor Roosevelt, very progressive, probably even more so than FDR. So when FDR ran, he promised a new deal for the forgotten man. He said that, keep in mind, TR had the square deal. So, it's kind of like playing off that language. But he believed that the deck had been rigged to benefit the sort of privileged class, and that the forgotten man was not being helped by the government, not being represented by the government. And FDR is very much a product of the progressive movement. So while progressivism had died out in the 20s, it is back in fury in the 30s. FDR is probably by far the greatest of the progressives in terms of governance. And one of the things that was so positive about FDR, and one of the things I liked about him, was he was so positive about America. And if you listen to his inaugural address, which I put that on the YouTube playlist, he talks about a line that I like that I hear later, and that is there's nothing wrong about our country that can't be fixed by what is right about our country, right? That's a great line. Well, FDR says, the thing that's really holding us back is fear. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Like, fear is crippling. Fear is the stuff that makes you do angry stuff. Fear is the stuff that makes you put your money, he'll say, in the mattress as opposed to in a safe bank. Like, fear is what caused the stock market crash. Fear is what we have to overcome. We have to restore confidence both in the United States people and in the United States government. And so, FDR will be routine. Whenever you see FDR depicted or photographed, he almost always, at least during the early years, is grinning. Like he doesn't have TR's big teeth, those huge molars that TR had. But FDR would smoke cigarettes with one of those cigarette holders, and he would have it like out like this, and he would always have like a grin on his, like he would, the only thing we have to fear. And so he would have this really neat, strong voice. And he would always have a smile on his face. You felt more alive and happy around FDR, which you kind of did sometimes around TR. Sometimes you couldn't stand him. So one of the key components of FDR's government is a sort of a kitchen cabinet. Now, he has the cabinet, and the cabinet is a very good cabinet, but he has a group of college professors that he brings to Washington, or he has them write what are called white papers, draft papers, and they have been studying every place in the world's response to the depressions. And they're intellectuals, and so they come with a ton of ideas. And this group will be informally known as the Brain Trust. So they're not like cabinet members officially, but they're administrative workers. They're assistants to the president. They'll call it special assistant, and they'll give the president all kinds of advice. Well, the thing that's interesting to me about FDR is he is going to consider Hoover's major problem inactivity. He says one of the things that will make America be more confident is if they see the government being very active in trying to stop this. One thing I'll give both President Trump and President Biden credit for during the pandemic is they did support and work with Congress to get a lot of relief to the American people. Now, I don't know if it's more relief than necessary, but both presidents didn't say, well, we'll suck it up, Buttercup. We'll wait till it's over. And so that's important. The country needs to see that the government is doing something. That's relevant when it comes to crises. So what he does is he believes that it's essential that the government put people back to work. And that's an important concept because that hadn't been the role of government before. Really, the only time the government had put people to work was in the spoil system. But he's not talking about that. Although I will tell you this, when you put 8 million people back to work, they're probably going to vote for you. So this does have the good political outcome of getting him a whole lot of supporters, and that's not a bad idea. If you want to shower money on the public, they'll probably vote for you. But the very first action he's going to take has to do with the banks. So every day, hundreds of banks were closing in America. Banks that were not able to, let's say you have a checking account, right? And you have money in the bank or a savings account, and you want to use that money. You want to give that money out to go, buy food. And you go to the bank and they're like, sorry, we don't have any cash today for you. Well, that made people panic. And so people were running to banks trying to get all their money out. Well, if you know anything about banks, they only have a reserve. They don't have all of the money that they've loaned out in the bank. It's not sitting there. And so people would do what were called run on the banks. If you've ever seen the great Frank Capra movie, which was made during the Depression, It's a Wonderful Life. Yeah, It's a Wonderful Life is a depiction of a run on the bank. In this case, the savings and loan, right? The SNL at Jimmy Stewart's town there, his bank. And so the run on the bank is kind of like a classic problem. And so he is going to announce, now this is the first of what will ultimately be 3,500 executive orders. So never in the history of our country, ever, has anyone done this many executive orders. Hoover did a lot. You can look back and see he did a lot. But this guy, President Roosevelt, almost issues an executive order every day of his presidency, and many times they'll come out in huge clumps. So what an executive order is the President of the United States directing the federal agencies to do something. So technically, he doesn't have the power to shut down the nation's banks, but that's what he does. He declares a national bank holiday. So it's like a federal holiday, right? And for over a weekend and for, I think it's like 5 or 6 days, all banks in America are closed. And then in his very first, what are called fireside chats, and we'll look at the fireside chats several times. There he is. He gives 30 of these things. Here he is sitting, and he would often sit in the Oval Office, and he would even bring people in. So right now I have people in the room that I'm talking to, right? So this is like a live, like imagine this sort of podcast that we're doing right now, right, with witnesses. So FDR would give these speeches on the radio, but it felt like he was just talking right to you. And he would actually have people in the room that he was talking right to. So it really was like he was communicating directly to you. So all those radios we bought in the 20s, we're now listening to. And so his very first fireside chat was declaring under this bill that Congress passes, the Emergency Bank Relief Act, right? He declares that the federal government will announce which banks are healthy and when they can reopen. So you as the American public, President Roosevelt said this bank is good. So I can, rather than keep my money in the mattress, keep in mind, when you keep your money in the mattress, it isn't circulating. Money's not credit anymore, right? And when you put your money in the bank, it gets loaned into your neighbor's house or somewhere down the road into a business, right? But if you store it all in your backyard, the money just stops, right? It doesn't circulate. And that's what people were doing. They were literally hiding it in jars in their backyard or under their mattress. So after he declares the end to the holiday, the banks are healthy. And so people are going, quote unquote. Now, I'll tell you, frankly, they don't really examine the banks closely. They don't go through their balance sheets to make sure. It's just like hitting the pause button. And when he hits the restart, the public is far more confident. They're like, Oh, okay, you can go back to the bank now. And so this helps. But in reality, what you're going to see here is just the very, very tip of the iceberg. Okay. And so you see up here under executive order of the president, right? So President Roosevelt is going to make so many executive orders, it's almost impossible to keep track of all of them. Sadly, his most infamous is going to come during World War II when he makes an executive order to put Japanese Americans in camps, right? And so, again, that's not at all a very positive story. But a lot of his sort of orders are to federal agencies. And during this period in history, we see a ton of federal agencies created. All right. So be aware of the use of executive orders. By the way, the presidents today use them a whole lot more than what was in the 19th century. So, for example, President Obama, President Trump, and now President Biden have all issued hundreds literally of executive orders. Like they make this common. And what happens is this does not carry the force of law. Literally, it's not a law. It's a direction to the federal government, but it's not a direction to you. You understand? Like the president cannot executively order you to do anything. He's your employee, not the other way around. But he can order the nation's employees of the government to do stuff. And so that's why you're going to see so many of these. So I have here a quote from FDR from the inaugural. Shouldn't be 32 though. Excuse me. He comes to office in 33. Remember after the lame duck period where Hoover wants to try to do something, but nobody will like pass his ideas. So he says our number one job as the government is to put people back to work. Like people need work. It's where your pride comes from, right? It's where your self-esteem comes from, being productive. By the way, this was a period in American history where virtually no one would say I'm comfortable on government assistance. Like that wouldn't have been a mindset. The American public was not in any way dependent on anyone, so to speak, for government aid. And so he doesn't want you to view it as government assistance. He wants you to view it as a job. You have an employer, right? And that way we're going to recruit, the government itself is going to do it. And we're going to treat it like a war, We're going to go to war on the Depression, this New Deal. But we're also going to accomplish great things that need to be done, particularly when it comes to infrastructure, he says, and for the natural resources. He's an environmentalist, conservationist. So FDR is planning bold stuff, and the American public just is giddy over that. Like, yes, put us back to work, give us jobs, make us feel productive again. And he's going to get most of these laws passed, and I do mean most of them, in his very first 100 days. So not only does he win the election in 1932, the Congress is overwhelmingly Democratic, like big time. And what they do is sometimes called rubber stamp. And I don't like this, but it was an extraordinary period in history. And that is basically FDR's brain trust would draft legislation. They would write up laws. They would send it to Congress, and Congress would just pass it. And so that's not checks and balances. And you're not going to see a lot of that in President Roosevelt's first two terms. The idea of checks and balances. It's overwhelmingly Democratic Congress, which whatever FDR wants, he gets, in these first 8 years. And by the way, some have called him a benevolent dictator. And that's not a bad, right? That's a fair criticism, meaning he can do pretty much whatever he wants. The good news is he's not Adolf Hitler. This is going to be a fortunate period where the stuff he does is going to be radical, but not revolutionary radical to the point of overthrowing democracy. So he has three major goals that you should write down and know. And I'll tell you, these three R's it's a smart way to look at what the sort of attack on the Great Depression is. When President Obama came into office, we were in the midst of the Great Recession. And one of his key first pieces of legislation, besides Obamacare, was a massive stimulus to the American public, right? But in that stimulus, he had regulations and he had long-term plans. And so a lot of the money was not stimulus. It was other stuff. And critics of his said, hey, man, that's absolutely not stimulus. And I always thought President Obama should have sort of pitched it like this, the three R's. Relief. So what's relief? Immediate help to people who need it. If you don't have a job, you don't have money, we're going to get you help like right away. And that would be stimulus, i.e. putting money into the economy right away, right? It's what we're doing right now with if your folks just got their $1,400 per person in the house deposit, I imagine they were happy about that, right? Hey, it's great to get $5,600 or whatever. And the hope that the government has is you're going to immediately spend that and put it right back in the economy and get the economy sort of going again, right? Going stronger. So that's relief. And again, FDR is not at all concerned about inflation. Like, he's not worried about it. That happens. Like, inflation is not a poor person's problem. Remember at this period in history during the Depression, it was deflation. It was not enough money circulating. Secondly, he's going to want to propose major changes, structural changes, to help America recover over the long term. So it's not only immediate aid, like here's a job or here's money, but here are some long-term projects that might take decades to do, but will create long-term success, right? And then lastly, and this is always necessary, I hope it comes after the pandemic or during the pandemic, we have to fix what causes the problem. What got us here in the first place? And so in America, I hope that after this moment, we will be more attentive to the development of viruses and illnesses around the world. We'll be more aware that happens and it can affect us and be smarter. Well, FDR wants to pass laws, get Congress to pass laws to take away the factors that created the Great Depression so that we'll never have another one. And to some degree that works. We really haven't had a Great Depression, although the Great Recession's causes were some way similar to the Depression. Now, I might put the phrase here, y'all, rubber stamp. That's an expression that means instead of signing your name, you get your name. Years ago, I was the Beta Club sponsor, and I don't know if I still have it. I'd have hundreds of graduates in the Beta Club, and I would have to write my name down, right? And that's not in here. I don't somewhere around here. And so I bought literally a rubber stamp with my signature on it. Principals do this. I'm giving away the secrets here, but so what you would do is just stamp the card, or stamp the certificate, like the Beta Club membership certificate, right, with my signature. So that idea of a rubber stamp means you're not really reading it or doing anything. You're just bounce. And so that's what Congress was doing. The White House would send them bills, and Congress would pass them just like that. And so that's pretty remarkable. And that 100 days. So I use the phrase 100 days, or I don't use it. The term 100 days is used, and it's now the benchmark for success for all of the presidents. So ever since FDR, every president has to kind of hit the ground running with some big idea because they don't have long. We call this, after a president gets elected, they have the support of the American people who voted, right? And that's called the honeymoon period, right? Like while the marriage is still fresh. And so, if you think about President Biden, he just proposed this sort of huge environmental redesign of the infrastructure of the United States, kind of the Green New Deal, they're calling it. And it'll cost trillions of dollars, but if you think about the nation's bridges and highways, they're in absolute disrepair. So this is something that's been needed to be done, and he'll have support for that. And he has a Democratic Congress. The question is whether or not the bill will get through the Democratic Congress or not, because it's barely that. Well, FDR is a willing Congress, which will pass everything he sends their way, basically. And so the first 100 days are when you see dozens and dozens of pieces of major legislation passed without hardly anyone reading, other than being told what it's for. So this is a big deal, the 100 days. So I mentioned that FDR was sort of like the zenith of progressivism, and this is what he's going to get accomplished that had been progressive goals. They're going to get unemployment insurance. So like if you lose your job for no fault of your own, you can collect for a period of time unemployment, right? You heard that phrase? Well, that's what FDR creates. Old age insurance. I know you're familiar with the term Social Security. That's that, right? He also has disability insurance created for people who are disabled. Minimum wage laws that are written into stone. Now minimum wage laws are going to become legal. He's definitely a conservationist. He's going to set aside a lot of public land, and they're going to end child labor during this period. They're going to extend collective bargaining rights during this period. So he is very much the ideal of what progressives had hoped. You're going to see tons of agencies created to regulate elements of the economy, expand regulations, particularly in the banking sector, right? So he is a big time progressive who's going to sort of enshrine this stuff into the American fabric. And this will become the sort of tradition of the American body politic until 1980, until the election of Ronald Reagan. And even then, Reagan doesn't try to utterly dismantle the New Deal. He just tries to stop the trend leftward that the New Deal has created. Like America shifted from conservatism in the 20s to liberalism, and we don't really shift back until the 80s. That's how strong FDR's stamp is on the American political system. All right. Big time. So what are some of the things he does? Well, I mentioned that one of the most important things that's a lasting legacy of President Roosevelt is his banking reform. So there are going to be two major changes that he's going to do in banking. So I already announced the bank holiday, which was from March 6th to March 10th, 1933. Okay. And, if you think about what progressives have accomplished, one of the things that they're really upset about, and really Americans are upset about, was this idea that if you went to the bank and tried to get your money out of it, the bank couldn't give it to you. Like, that's a problem, right? And so they create the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. So if you've ever been to the bank, you might have seen this sticker on the door, or you hear a bank commercial, member FDIC, right? So this is FDIC. This was created under President Roosevelt. And what FDIC is, it guarantees the amount of money you put in the bank up to a certain amount. It's insurance for bank deposits. And that makes people comfortable. Like if I leave $250,000 in the bank and the bank gets robbed or burned down or the bank closes, the government insures that. So I'll get that $250,000 back. So that helps immediately solve the problem of banks. The second thing they do, which, by the way, has been eliminated during the Clinton administration, is the Glass-Steagall Act. Now, your book doesn't talk about Glass-Steagall, but I feel it's imperative since the repeal of it, I think, is one of the contributing factors to the recession of 2007. Glass-Steagall takes banks and divides them between lending institutions, your ordinary banks, commercial banks, and then investment banks. So imagine like, Morgan Stanley or Bear Stearns. So these are investment banks. When you put your money in them, you know that the bank is investing that money, right? That's kind of what you're aware of. When you put your money in, let's say BB&T or something, you expect that money is going to be safe. Like it's not money that the bank could lose. Well, that stays that way. So you have lending institution banks and you have commercial investment banks separated until the 1990s. That's repealed. And so you have banks that were like Wells Fargo or Citibank or Bank of America. We're doing both, being both big time investors and also being lending institutions. And what they do is they get overextended in the Great Recession. They lend out, they invest way too much money in what are called toxic assets. And that fails, and that pulls down a lot of people's savings. But anyway, Glass-Steagall is a major reform of the banking industry, right? As is FDIC. And we have both of those. Now, a huge moment is initially FDR had the irony of President Roosevelt's campaign in 32 is he runs against Hoover for deficit spending. You understand deficits is when the government spends more money than it takes in, right? And so things like the Hoover Dam and RFC had been about $2 billion, and so had created some deficits. So FDR runs against that, saying that was bad leadership by the Republicans. And then he is going to explode the deficit. When he leaves office, well, no, I shouldn't say it that way. When the New Deal ends, it cost America about $20 billion. That's 10 times the amount of money Hoover spent. All right, that gives you a sense of perspective. And one of the things he's going to make a decision to do is called managed currency. So he is actually going to intentionally take the nation off the gold standard. He issues an executive order requiring every American to turn in their gold. Like every American has to turn in their hard gold, under penalty of law. That's this, all right? And then they start printing money. Finally, the Federal Reserve begins to act. So they're increasing the monetary supply, right? But at a managed way. So that's kind of what the Fed does now. They manage the currency. So if there's too much money, they raise interest rates. If there's not enough money, they lower interest rates. Well, that's kind of what they start doing here. But he's also going to base this. Now, I probably shouldn't mention Keynes here. Keynes's major book comes out in that's how you pronounce this guy's name, this fellow right here. It's John Maynard Keynes, not Keynes. But I'll mention him again in 1936 because his major work, the General Theory, comes out in 36. FDR's guys read it. They take it to him, and he's like, yeah, this works. And so he's fully going to adopt what's called Keynesianism in 1937. Makes sense? But initially, he's comfortable supporting inflation. He's not going to let the foolish dollar sign slow down helping human beings out, right? And this allows the government to pay people, more people, pay more people money, and also allows the government to buy goods and services and stuff like that. So a lot more money in circulation. So this is kind of like intentional inflation. He doesn't do it as a populist. I want to make sure you understand that he's not doing this because the populace said this is a solution to their problem. He's doing this because there's not enough money in circulation. Like literally, that's the problem. And so the Fed had been inactive. So he's doing what we would call today monetary policy, which is not typically the domain at all of the president, but that's this president. So I said I wouldn't mention it, but I have a PowerPoint on it. So the guy that you need to learn, whose name is John Maynard Keynes, he's here. He was a British economist at Cambridge. This guy, Cambridge is like the other major college in Britain beside Oxford. Those are the two biggies. This guy actually was born in Cambridge, so he was kind of intended to go there all along, probably. But he had come along during the Depression in Britain and had been an economist writing about it. And he wrote a book called The General Theory. The full title. So if you want to, help yourself out here, go over to question number 62. I'm jumping way ahead on your chapter guide, but that's where this is in my notes. So Keynes authors a work that is monumental. I've got a copy of it back there. It's big. It's called The General Theory. That's the short name for it. The full name, if you look at it, is The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. So this is Keynes's book right here. Not too big. Not Adam Smith Wealth of Nations big. So this is the Keynesian book on employment. And what Keynes is going to do is turn the sort of Andrew Mellon argument on its ear. Up to this point, pretty much and you've had economics, you probably learned about this. The consensus view had been that economy was completely driven by production. So the supply is what determined the state of the economy. And so we call that supply side economics, the idea of how much stuff is made, But Keynes says it's not that. He said it's demand driven. In reality, it's the purchasing power of people, how much money they have. Are they employed? Because you can create all the supply in the world you want, but if people don't have any money, they can't buy it. So that's where he writes his general theory of employment. So he's going to argue things like wages have to rise in order to purchase goods. Okay. And one of the key things about it is he says that, unfortunately, and this is interesting, a free market economy can enter sort of stagnant periods where it stops being highly productive and employs a lot of people. So the 20s, huge productivity, but people were starting to not be necessary because of things like technology and overproduction. And so the argument was, up until this point, the only way to get the business going was to cut taxes, right? Mellon, cut taxes, and then the business would create more jobs and more purchasing. He didn't say that's wrong. He said, but there's times when, unfortunately, the people don't keep up with the growth of stuff. Like they can't afford to buy the stuff. And so he said, when that happens, you have to have what is called the lender, or in this case, the spender of last resort. So he says, if the economy isn't employing people, if the economy is not paying people, then who should be the employer of last resort? The government. So in other words, if the private sector freezes, which is the argument in 1929, it froze, the economy, the invisible hand of the free market stopped working. It just shut down. And he argued the only way to really restart it feasibly without great suffering is to get money to the people. And then they would go out and increase demand. And then the employers will say, okay, we got to sell stuff, so we'll hire people. And then the snowball starts rolling again, kind of thing. So that is what FDR is going to fully embrace. Now, initially, he doesn't. In 32 and 33 and 34, he's still trying to, quote unquote, balance a budget, although he's not. But he's aware of deficits. By 36, it's not working. He's got to go deeper into spending. He's got to basically intend to run debts. Now, here's where it gets, I think, off the rails. And I do think it went off the rails. Keynes did not advocate this when the economy is doing well. So in other words, if the economy is doing well, what should not be injecting money into the economy? The government. Like there's no need for the government to employ people as competition against the private sector, right? Like that doesn't add up. And what's going to happen by the 1970s, that's what's happening. People are more dependent on government than the private sector, which is exactly what Hoover was afraid would happen, right? So when the economy is in a deep slump, he thought that's when the government should provide resources, right? Because the price will change. You just now have money to go afford it. And once you can go buy it, then we don't need to employ you anymore, right? Because who's going to employ you? Your old employer. You're going to go back to work for them, and we're not going to employ you anymore. So Keynes never intended for the government to be sort of a permanent employer of a large segment of the economy. And I don't mean directly the government either. I mean, like, up the road, we have Babcock and Wilcox, right? People are proudly independent-minded working there, and they're proud of the good job they have. Well, their major contract is the federal government. They're a government job just through a private industry, right? And Goodyear, one of its largest sources of customer is the federal government. That's who they sell tires to, military particularly. So that's not what Keynes had intended to happen, like a permanent government social state. But people who like the large-scale deficit spending side weren't really concerned about the other argument. So what you're going to see, and I think it's terrible, is both parties are going to embrace this for a long time, but not at first. Initially, this is a New Deal, but later you're going to see deficit spending all the way up into your lifetime. And my concern is, as I've told you ad nauseum, is that's so normal, that the debts are so big that by the time you have a chance to become an adult or your kids are adults, that won't be possible anymore. And then what do you do? What do you do when the government, which is the employer of last resort, stops employing people? Then is the private sector just going to pick up and hire everybody who's out of work in the government? I doubt it. So we're looming on a major problem. Now, what should the government do? Ironically, it's the kind of stuff that Biden is doing, proposing long-term capital projects. Highways pay for themselves. FDR says nobody calls highways socialism, right? Like that's not socialism to build a highway. And so the value of the highway will pay for itself. Goods and services will flow on it. People will be able to transport back and forth. So the stuff that FDR and the New Deal is going to build a lot are capital projects, dams for hydroelectricity, highways, bridges, tunnels, parkways. All of these are big time projects, but they're not meant to be something you do forever. Once the Depression ends, all those things go away, right? Or more importantly, once World War II starts, all those things go away. Everybody's going to go from building highways and bridges and dams to building tanks and airplanes and bombers and stuff like that. You understand? So that's, I guess I'll go ahead and tell you now because I think it's relevant. The New Deal costs $20 billion, right? The cost of World War II to the United States is $200 billion. So if you can do the math here, Hoover spends $2 billion. FDR spends $20 billion. World War II costs $200 billion. And you want to know ends the Great Depression? World War II. So, that's when the government spends so much deficits, but we're comfortable saying we spend deficits on fighting Nazis, right? We're not comfortable saying we spend deficits to employ people, which is interesting to me because it's the same principle. You're still the government spending the money, and so that's Keynesianism is once the economy gets going, you're not supposed to keep deficit spending. Like that's bad. And unfortunately, that idea didn't stick. So anywho, getting back to FDR, let's talk about the most popular of all the so-called alphabet soup agencies. Now, I'm going to give you a quiz next week, and it's a really easy quiz. It's 10 matching, and you just have to match the agency with, what they did. Now, the problem is there are a lot of these agencies that tend to overlap. So it can get confusing, particularly once you start looking at their initials, and that's why it's called alphabet soup. So you're going to have the CCC, the AAA, the WPA, the PWA. Thanks for confusing, right? The CWA, the NYA. So you have all these different agencies, and students forever learning the New Deal have to learn that stuff, and that's tricky. So initially, FDR was wary of handouts. There was a very strong sentiment that just giving people money wasn't what the government should do. Like, here, have some money. So what he wanted to do was put people to work, right, to solve unemployment. And so one of the very first agencies created in the 100 Days, which I consider the most popular, was the CCC. Now, the CCC was 18 to 25-year-old men who would be taken from places of large unemployment. So imagine like Richmond or Charlotte or New York or wherever, big places, and then they would take them to rural locations where they would then do things for conservation purposes. So, for example, they built the Blue Ridge Parkway. You guys heard of that place? Or the Appalachian Trail. You heard of that? They built that. They helped build that, so to speak. So they're going to have these really cool jobs. They're hard. They're tough jobs. Soil conservation, forestation, flood control. By the way, not open to African Americans. So FDR is not ready to make that sort of plunge into civil rights equality. Like, he's not going to do that. And he can't do that because, so to speak, he can't, because the Democrats from the South will balk and join with the Republicans and stop the legislation. So the Dems in the South will work with FDR as long as it doesn't look like something that's helping black people. Well, guys, this is hugely popular. Look at what, not just the discrimination part, but the young men part. Because if you think about who are most likely to commit crimes during periods of major unemployment, 18 to 25-year-old men, right? Like young gang members and stuff like that. So you're going to take them from the environment where they might be gang members. You're going to feed them and house them. And then they're going to send their check back home to their family. So they're basically like in the military, but it's a civilian style, okay? And their family will get their money. And they felt like they were helping out. They were supporting their family. And this was a huge success. It was very, very popular. I'm going to give you a little bit of local history here. If you're at Tunstall and you drive down here to Mount Cross Road, I imagine most of you at least once in your life have driven down Mount Cross Road. So you're driving down and you go past Jones's Market, right? And it's a big drop, like a hill. It goes down, right? Does anybody know the road that breaks off from Whitmore School Road right there at Jones's Market? So if you're going down Mount Cross, you hang a left at Jones's Market, and then you hang a quick right. And it comes out all the way down on Lanier's Mill Road. Well, Lanier's Mill is the one that connects to Golf Club Road. Anybody know between Lanier's Mill and Whitmore School what that little road's called? All right. It's called Camp View Road. A little local history, right? Camp View. So if you stay on Mount Cross, so you're driving down towards Danville from Tunstall, you pass Mills, you pass Jones's, and then you take this big drop down. You have to ride your brake down the bottom of the hill, right? Into this valley. And then you ride up, and there's a crossroads. You guys know where I'm at? Well, before you get out of that valley, next time, take a quick glance to your left, and you'll see like an open field with some small houses, right? That hill that you're driving up and down is called CC Hill. Now, a lot of young people in this area don't know that anymore. They don't know Dry Fork, Tunstall, history. But that's called CC Hill because looking over there on the hill to the left used to be a civilian conservation camp. And some of those little buildings are now houses. Like somebody renovated them and turned them into houses. That used to be like barracks for the CCC. And so the road that's above the hill looking down is Camp View. So when they named that road, you can look down on these CCC camps, right? So we had Civilian Conservation Corps right here in Pennsylvania, right here in Tunstall, And so and I've looked for letters and stuff about that. And every year I tell my students to go look for, like, ask your grandparents were they in the CCC, grandfathers. But I think we're getting to the age where that's not possible anymore. That the history not necessarily lost, but it's not found. I'll put it that way. So CCC very popular. Because it puts young people to work, and it's not that expensive compared to some of the later bigger agencies, but it's very it's seen as fraternal. The guys hang out, they play ball in the evenings, and it gives them optimism and hope, and that's a good start. Okay, other similar agencies are going to be created under the auspice of what is called the FERA. So the other one that's kind of like the CCC is the National Youth Administration, which gives jobs to young people in urban areas. If you're working and things like making public pools, for example, or planting trees, just anything that they can do to be productive. Now, all of this is going to be run by an old progressive named Harry Hopkins. He was very much convicted and part of this brains trust, and very much a social justice advocate. And he is going to be put in charge of a huge agency called the FERA. And the key word in the Federal Emergency Relief Act is the word relief. So this is actually the dole. This is actually handouts. And so, in other words, it's the winter of 33. It's wintertime. People are hungry. They're going to freeze to death probably. They have no money. And the federal government says, we can't have that. So they're going to give out millions of people money, like just cash. So you would go, now they give it to the states. It's done in block grant. The federal government can't technically just do this. So they have to give it to the states. And then the states distribute it. And what it is you would go down to the relief office. That's what it was called, the relief office. And you would get your $120 for the month or whatever it was, whatever amount that was they were giving at that time. And so there are people in America today, Andrew Yang is one I think is interesting, who have talked about something called the Universal Basic Income, UBI. And that's the idea that every American should be guaranteed like a floor of money, kind of like a minimum wage for annually. So this is kind of that, the idea that we're not going to let people have no money and starve to death, because the nation's soup kitchens were overwhelmed. The theory is that charity would solve the problem. Charity couldn't come close to solving this problem. It dwarfed the ability of soup kitchens and churches and kind-hearted people. They just could not possibly help millions of people, billions of dollars worth. So the government spends this money. All right. And what's interesting about it is that by 1941, you don't have to worry about this anymore. You put 20 million men in uniform and put everybody else back to work. So by 1941, Pearl Harbor, and certainly 1942, we're going to have zero unemployment, which is radical to think about. But this doesn't end the Great Depression. It makes it better, I think, for a whole lot of people, but it doesn't end it. So what are some other things? Now, when I think about the first AAA, it's going to be declared unconstitutional. So what you should know about the first AAA was the idea of paying them not to farm, which when you tell people that, that's like, what? So what the government did is it told farmers, you are overproducing. So if you will only produce X amount, we will make up the difference in your losses. So it paid them literally not to farm. Cut back on production. It also created a program that lasted to this day, although it's kind of different now, and that is surplus food would not be destroyed. That was something that was going on before. Like they were killing hogs and plowing under fields, and like, that's bad. We don't be destroying food when people in America are hungry. So they would buy up surplus food and distribute to the American people through what was called the food stamp program. So the food stamp program was created during the New Deal by the Department of Agriculture, still run by the Department of Agriculture. And so the idea of it initially was to take unsold food and get it to the people who couldn't buy food. Does that make sense? So unfortunately, this sounded really weird because we were basically telling farmers not to farm when we had actually people starving in America. Right? Like, that's odd. Right? And also, this paid the landowner itself not to farm. Well, sharecroppers didn't own the land, which means they got fired. They said, we don't need your services this year. And that hurt blacks again. And so you can see here that you would think that the New Deal didn't benefit blacks, but it definitely does here. The FDR does give money to African Americans. So, and by the way, I'll tell you a little political trick here. These relief checks would usually come out right before the election. All right. So just in case you aren't sure who was taking care of you, one of the things that's interesting about this relief this year is it's in March, because America needs it right now. But at least that's the argument. So anyway, definitely a neat idea. But what it did is, and you'll see the Supreme Court's going to rule on this later, is that it took a power that under the 10th Amendment should be the states, the Supreme Court ruled, and it gave it to the federal government. And so they're going to rule this unconstitutional. And that'll be one of many things FDR gets mad about. So some more alphabet soup agencies. You're going to see the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which is a really great idea. I wish we had done more of this during the Great Recession. So let's say, you can't pay your mortgage. Well, the bank doesn't really want to foreclose because the bank can't do anything with a house either in a depression. The bank can't live in the house. The bank can't eat in the house. The bank's got to sell the house. The problem is nobody got any money to buy your house. So what they allowed, the HOLC did, HOLC, was to let people refinance their mortgage so they would have much lower payments over a longer period of time. And which to this day, we still refinance mortgages, okay? And this really got a lot of middle-class people happy. because one of the key components of being a middle-class person is home ownership. And people were living in dread of not being able to make their house payment. And this fixed that. Okay. He also creates a job program that was in the winter of 33, another tough year in terms of money. And it put people to work called the Civil Works Administration. Civil meaning not very big, I guess is the best way to put it, like local. And so what it did was it would pay people to do jobs in their communities. So jobs like dog watch. John Steinbeck, the great writer, would get a job during this period being paid to count the number of stray dogs in his Los Angeles County. So some of these jobs seem a little bit, but the phrase for a government job to get money that you don't have to do any work is called a boondoggle, right? And so critics would call leaf raking and snow shoveling a boondoggle, like to have a federal job doing that stuff. But, for FDR, it's not really about what they're doing. It's the fact that they're doing something and getting money. We're trying to get the economy kick-started. Think of it as like a jump start to the economy. Like just the analogy they usually used back then was pump priming. So I don't know if that analogy resonates with you guys, but if you understand how a pump works, if it has no water in the pump, then it can't start pumping water out. So you actually have to prime it by putting some water in it, right? So that creates the suction, the vacuum to pull it out, more water. So he's arguing that the federal government's putting the water into the pump to kind of prime the economy to get it going. That's always sort of his initiative. He's not planning on creating a society where everybody has a government job long term, but in the short term, that's kind of what it seems to be happening. So this book won the Pulitzer Prize. It's one of it's back there. I have a copy of it. It's one of the American heritage books of the history of the United States. And it's called Freedom from Fear. And the author of it is your history book author, the American Pageants author, David Kennedy. Professor Kennedy is a professor at Stanford, and he wrote sort of the definitive book on the New Deal called Freedom from Fear. And he said, if we saw the New Deal in a normal period, this would be social change, like major social reform. That's not necessarily purely what FDR is trying to do. He said, or in a disintegrating society, it would be a stabilizing effort. And that's kind of what he's trying to do. Or economic. But he says all three of these were part of the New Deal. In other words, FDR was a progressive who was trying to save a failing society, right, and urgently get the economy going again. So when critics of FDR are going to call him communist or pink, not quite red, but pink, he's going to argue you have to use a little bit of social democracy, of socialism, to save capitalism from communism, right? So he's not a communist. And I really want to emphasize this. What FDR does is at a period when other places around the world, think Nazi Germany, they're turning fully socialist, fascist, communist Russia, Stalin, he's like, I have to keep the America core, so to speak, living. And we don't want to be either fascist or communist. So I believe that in many ways, FDR's policies both saved capitalism and saved democracy. Because people were willing to try just about anything during the Depression, and including Adolf Hitler. So perhaps because of this crisis was so severe, Roosevelt had an unmatched opportunity to affect major society reforms and change the landscape of politics. So Kennedy is, I think, completely right. Of course, I've read his book, and I guess I'm biased. But FDR really does revolutionize the American society. Like his policies change the nature of our country. And the debate will always be for better or for worse. Now, again, I point out that he does this because there are people in America who are way, I'm going to say worse than FDR. At least two of them. The other one's not a demagogue per se. But a demagogue is an interesting word. It's demagogue. I've had students write demigod. These are not like Hercules or, Thor. So a demagogue is a fearmonger. It's somebody who, as a politician or a leader or a public figure, appeals to the worst nature of human beings. They appeal to their fears, right? They appeal to their superstitions, their prejudices. And FDR didn't do that. FDR was not a demagogue. He tried to inspire and lift up and be optimistic. But two of these guys particularly were quite interesting as far as what they became. One was a Catholic Canadian priest who had moved to Detroit, to Michigan. And he was one of the very first to use the radio effectively, starting in 1930. And his name was Father Coughlin, and he was a socialist by advocacy. He called it social justice, and he wanted to redistribute wealth and go after the banks hardcore. And if you'll notice, the Glass-Steagall Act didn't eliminate banking; it streamlined and made them more efficient. The FDIC didn't get rid of banking; it insured banks. So the far left, the radical left, saw FDR as betraying, their agenda by being they considered him as in bed with the banks, if you can imagine that. So he was infamously anti-Semitic. He believed that there was a Jewish conspiracy of all the banks, and that's an old but very well traveled bigoted anti-Semitism. So he was very anti-Semitic. He got so bad that FDR during World War II is actually going to have his program canceled because he was sympathetic of Hitler and was sort of openly endorsing fascism. And that's, and he was very popular. Like 30 million people listened to his radio broadcast. So recognize that there were people in America who were offering a different sort of narrative. The one that FDR was most concerned about, he said he was one of the two most dangerous men in America, was Huey Long. Now, Huey Long was absolutely loved in Louisiana and feared. He was a very effective populist who, by all accounts, was a socialist because he wanted to tax the wealthy completely and redistribute their wealth to the poor. And he taxed Louisiana oil rigs and stuff like that and built the biggest building. They had the biggest capitol in America down in is it Baton Rouge? Where the heck is the capital? Anyway, Baton Rouge, right. So they this big, tall building. He paid for the construction of the Louisiana State University. So, LSU, he paid for that basically on taxes on the rich. And he became the governor and created a huge political machine. They called him the Kingfish. He was like a boss. He ran the whole political machine of Louisiana. And he'll end up becoming a senator. And he'll give one of the longest filibusters of the period. And he was very popular, but he was also a brute. He was a thug. His men beat up anybody who was opposed to him. They may have murdered people. And later on, there'll be a book written about him called All the King's Men, about the Kingfish, by a professor of English at LSU, ironically. So anyway, he's going to get a gerrymandering bill, anti-gerrymandering quote bill, that will put a judge who doesn't like him out of his seat. He's going to get this judge removed, basically. And the judge's son comes up to him, about a foot or two away, I guess, and shoots him. And it goes through his intestines. That he gets in the car and goes to the hospital. They suture him up and stuff, but he has internal bleeding and he dies from it. So Huey Long dies in 1935. That guy could have been dictator of America. Like, he was that popular. You understand? But very, very comfortable breaking the rules, like breaking the laws, breaking the norms of not only politics, but like I said, he was kind of like a fascist, but he was popular at the time. Now, I don't know why people didn't shoot him in the head or the chest, but yeah, they hit him in the gut. The guy did. And by the way, his bodyguard shot the guy who shot him 60 times. Like they turned it, but Huey Long had bodyguards that they didn't stop him. I don't know all the details of how he shot him and why, but I do know his dad was a judge. So anyway, this other guy, I don't really think was a demagogue. He probably doesn't belong in the same category. He wasn't like a fascist or anything like that, but he was an old guy, as the picture shows. And he came up with a radical idea of every American who was over the age of, I think it was 60 at the time, should get, he believed, $200 a month. Every month. They should get $200 a month. And then, that was a lot of money, right? That was a whole lot of money. But they had two conditions for his proposal. And it's called the Townsend Plan. And the two positions was that you could not be a criminal. Like, you could not be a convict. You can have a record, a felon. And you had to spend it within 30 days. So basically, you would just get the money from the government, go out and buy stuff immediately, and as old people. So this was really popular. Like, lots of people, older people particularly, were listening to the Townsend Plan, as it was called. And so there's a lot of people who believe that the creation of Social Security, which was a European concept, was sort of steamrolled even faster to cut this guy off, like, because this was way too much money, to be given away at this time. The argument went, but yeah, the Townsend Plan will help lay the foundation for Social Security. So I don't think he's really a demagogue so much as he wanted old people to have a lot of money compared to the fact that they were not having any money. So tomorrow we'll pick up with, or not tomorrow, next week on Monday, we'll pick up with an agency that will be the most expensive and a very popular one called the WPA, and we'll continue with Alphabet Soup. So I'm going to stop the recording now and see if you guys have any last minute questions before we